Some were partial footwear impressions, and so I cut the transparency to kind of fit onto the photograph itself.
And let me give you a better example. When we were looking at the dryer vent, you said you were looking at one specific area of the shoe and comparing to the dryer vent. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In the carpet scenario, when you were looking at the carpet impressions, are you looking at different areas of the shoe, including that one area, but also the rest of the shoe as well?
Yes, several impressions had the front portion or the ball area of the shoe, and then other impressions on the carpet had the whole shoe impression on itself.
No further questions.
Cross-examination, Ms. D.
And to bring up the PowerPoint, because I have a few questions that I think it would be just easiest to refer back to slide numbers in your presentation, so I will just indicate those for Chiquita when we get to them. So I guess we'll start out, actually, if we could just go to slide 12. And you told us a bit at the beginning about the sort of dual specialties you have at the CCBI, and those are that you do both fingerprint examinations.
Yes, ma'am.
And you do footwear examinations.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think we've heard a lot of different sort of definitions from a lot of different people, but my memory is you're the person who said at some point today that latent evidence is just what's left behind.
Yes, ma'am.
And so that both of those are different types of latent evidence comparisons.
Yes, ma'am. Latent can refer to what is left behind, but it also can refer to what is hard to see.
Okay. And with both the finger print and I guess foot actual, any ridge detail, whether it's on the hand or foot, those examinations are, you train for those in a similar manner, correct? And get certified to do fingerprints in the same way that you're trained to do the ridge evaluations on feet?
I would say the training program is very similar. Yes, ma'am.
And then for those evaluations and also for the footwear evaluations, you use this methodology that's up on slide 12, the ACE V.
Yes, ma'am.
And then you went through and you talked sort of about the different components of that evaluation, going through your slideshow and also in response to some questions from Mr. Waller. And that's the analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that whole process involves comparing a known to an unknown.
When you get to the comparison portion of the methodology, then yes.
Okay. And so without that, you can't do ACE-B without having the comparison component.
Not necessarily, because you can do the analysis portion of it, and if it, like in the homicide, the carpet that lacked sufficient detail, so I did my analysis, but I was not able to go on any further with the comparison. So I did do the analysis portion of the methodology, but that stopped.
So would it be fair to say that many processes can stop at different points along the way, whether it's this process or a lot of other processes, you'll come to some point at which you can't go any farther.
Depending on the situation, I would agree with that. Yes, ma'am.
You're making a cake and you don't have any sugar, you gotta stop making the cake.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, and so, would it be fair to say that using the ACE-B method for an examination, without being able to do a comparison, you can't draw any results based on this methodology, except for perhaps the result that there's insufficient data?
I would say that's correct.
And so in the case that you're looking at here, you also told us about, if we can go down to the evaluation section to slide 14. You told us.
It'll be easier for you to get this.
Okay, sorry. This lays out, I'm going to be on the right side myself. This lays out the different sort of conclusions you can reach as over the course of this type of analysis, right?
For footwear impressions, yes.
And you told us in giving your results, and also I think even at the beginning, talking about what the actual definition of a limited association of class characteristics is. You told us that it means that some similar class characteristics are present, but there are significant limiting factors in the questioned impression that do not permit stronger association.
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
And you told the jury when you went through each of your conclusions what the significant limiting factors were with regards to each conclusion.
Yes, ma'am.
And those factors, which we've heard about here and are common in this conclusion, are that there's insufficient detail, lack of scale, improper position of scale, and improper photographic techniques, which, as you say, can lead to distortion of the photos or of the images.
Some of that is correct. I'm not sure that I said anything about scale. There were scales in the photo, but there was the plane was not parallel and perpendicular for the footwear impressions that were in the burglary. Yes.
And I think you told us that in at least a few of the instances, because the angle had not been precise in taking the pictures, the scale was then skewed when you put down a scale in the lab.
Yes, ma'am.
So those are the type of limitations that then, create the inability to make any different other type of a conclusion.
Those can affect my conclusion. Yes.
And therefore, with this type of conclusion, if we go down one more slide here to 15, and this is where you put all the different types of conclusions a footwear examiner can reach with the sort of neutral line in the middle. And all the findings made in this case are there at that first line over from the neutral position, which is a limited association of class characteristics.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
All the findings in this case are of that type of finding.
Yes, I did use the scale as kind of representation to help visually aid the jury in the evaluations.
And I believe that would it be fair to say that because of the type of limiting factors that you have in these different samples that you've seen, that you as the examiner have a limited conclusion to a general association of some class characteristics?
I did not use the general association. I did use the limited association because of some of the limiting factors.
And the language I just read, though, is sort of another way that might sometimes be termed in a report of a footwear.
There is a difference between limited association and association of class characteristics. Association of class characteristics is it's kind of the limiting, but without the limiting factors, if that makes sense. So your association actually has class characteristics that are maybe more quality or quantity. They're a little bit more clear. But because I had those limiting factors, I could only go that far.
Well, I'm not going to lie and say I totally understood that difference, but basically you're saying that that your conclusions were that there's a limited association of class characteristics.
That is exactly what I'm saying. Yes, ma'am.
And I'll just leave it there instead of confusing myself more. And in the evaluation that you did in this case, just to be clear, they are all class characteristics and not individual characteristics.
For both cases, yes, ma'am.
And you talked during your PowerPoint is generally kind of broken up into two parts. One was sort of a general part at the beginning when you sort of explain the terms and explain the process, and then I guess two parts at the end when you talk about the evaluation or analysis you did and the two separate scenes in this case.
Yes, ma'am.
And during that earliest part of the PowerPoint, I understood you to be saying that certain types of wear basically are so general that they are not individualized. So, you know, everybody's going to wear their shoes in some ways that don't show whether a person pronates or has a high arch or has a flat foot or any of those more individualized characteristics that you showed at the beginning of your PowerPoint.
Yes, ma'am. The second you take your shoe out of the box and it hits a surface, you start to wear that shoe. Yes.
The carpet sample that you have up there as one of the state's exhibits in this case, that's the carpet sample from the upstairs apartment from the homicide scene.
I do have a photo. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and so you actually have the box also?
I don't have the box up here. I just have the photo.
You just have the photo. That is the photo you took in the lab. Do I remember that correctly?
The photo that is currently up here is not what I took. It is what was at the scene. The photos that I used in my PowerPoint presentation, that was the photos that I took.
Okay, and that's what I'm looking at, and that's why I'm confused. I apologize. So you did take pictures of that in the lab, but you also had a picture of that from the scene.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
And the pictures that you had, I know that the number has been told to us here recently, but you had a large number of pictures from the downstairs burglary scene of footwear impressions.
Yes, ma'am.
And a lot of those were footwear impressions that went all around the different placard locators to try and use different light and to take pictures of each of those impressions from as many different angles and lighting sources as possible. Do you remember that?
I can't personally speak to it because I didn't take the photos, but I have seen the photos.
You have seen the photos, and you remember them. You look at crime scene photos often.
I wouldn't say often, but when I need to, yes, ma'am.
And you can tell you work with Melissa Southern quite often.
Yes, ma'am.
And so her primary job in assisting you is to enhance photos by increasing the contrast, so you're able to identify elements of footwear impressions or whatever it is that you're looking at in the photo.
I would say that's accurate.
And with the downstairs pictures in this case, do you remember, and obviously you can tell us if you don't, but do you remember there being an effort to use light sources in a way to try and do the same thing on the scene?
I do remember looking at the photos, and there was different, I could tell just from crime scene experience, the different angles of the light sources. So I could tell that light was used in different angles, yes.
And the photos that you remember of the upstairs carpet impression, do you remember there being a similar large number of photos of that impression taken from multiple angles and with multiple lighting sources?
That, off the top of my head, I do not remember.
And you were not, did you send that upstairs impression to Melissa Southern for enhancement at all?
I do not believe so.
And when you mentioned that you have, obviously some experience with how the scenes are processed. When the crime scene investigators are on scene, they obviously take a lot of measures to preserve the evidence that's there.
I can speak for myself, and when I did do crime scene, yes.
And one of those, do they wear foot protection to try and not increase the number of impressions in the carpet after they're on scene?
I'm not sure what they did in this particular one.
And is that something that people will do sometimes to try to take measures to make sure that they don't increase the number of impressions that are in the scene to not?
I would say that it's usually a good practice. Yes, ma'am.
And I just want to go back briefly to
two other things. One, I forgot. That when you're doing the ACE-V analysis at the CCBI, you told us that there are 2 people that are certified to do the footwear impressions.
There are 2 people that are qualified, myself and my forensic, or my supervisor. Yes, ma'am.
And that's, I think you told us her name is Rebecca Heinrich?
Heinrich, yes, ma'am.
Heinrich. And so she's the person who did the verification of your analysis in this case.
Yes, she verified and tech reviewed my work.
And you do the same for her?
I mostly do the comparisons, but if she did have a case, I would, yes, ma'am.
Because you're the only, there have to be at least, do there have to be at least 2 in order to do it? Or do you, if there aren't 2, do you send them out to another agency?
Because we are an accredited lab, we do require that there be verification and tech review. I would say if, for example, we did not have one, then we would either send it out or we would have another agency do it.
Okay. If we can go to slide 63. You were telling us, when you were talking about the dryer vent, you told us about some of the reasons that there appeared to be multiple prints, and could be movement of the shoe, could be that the vent folded in on itself. And so those were some of the limitations that you faced in doing an evaluation of that print.
Yes, ma'am.
But you also told us that there were aspects of that print that just didn't match. And so that was another limitation that you faced.
Yes, there were aspects in the latent print that I saw but did not see in the known. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes that happens in fingerprints as well because it is a chance impression.
And with regards to you answered a question about the impression that's on the deck railing.
Yes, ma'am.
And you answered a question to the effect of the fact that you were not able to tell based on your analysis of the 3 impressions there whether an individual was going up or down. Do you remember that question?
Yes, ma'am, and that would be correct.
You can't tell from that static impression anything about who's moving where or doing what?
No, ma'am, I cannot.
And also when you were talking about that impression, you talked about the fact that footwear impressions always overlap.
They often do. I'm not sure that I said always. If I did, it was a mistake. They often do overlap just because it's an area that is very common most of the time.
That was my next question. So prints will often overlap because it's an area where people walk.
Yes, ma'am.
And in this instance, were you aware of the fact that this was new construction?
I believe I had read the agent's report, and that's when I realized it. Yes, ma'am.
And those 3 prints that are there on the outside at location marker in, those are on a railing?
Yes.
And just one final question I wanted to ask, focusing on the just at the tail end where you had your summary, and you showed get myself confused. I think that it's 63 that's up there. Did I ask for 63 or 64?
Yes, for 63. This is 63.
63. 63 is perfect. If you, may I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
When you were talking about the class characteristics in this shoe, both the right and the left of the red and black shoes, you talked about the fact that it was primarily the, oh my gosh, I'm going to get it backwards, but the part where there's rubber missing. What's that called?
So the recessed area.
The recessed area. The recessed area at the back. So this is what you're talking about, right?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so and so with these shoes in the downstairs apartment, that was sort of, that's the characteristic that you were mostly basing that result on.
That would be kind of the area that I focused in on first, but then there's also the overall shape of the shoe impression itself. Yes, ma'am.
So the size and the shape and that at the back.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
And Your Honor.
Redirect.
No, Your Honor, thank
All
you.
right, thank you, ma'am. You may step down.
Thank you.
I know there's another witness waiting. Do you reasonably expect that we'll get through that witness?
I don't expect we'll finish, but we can get started.
All right, that's fine. Let's go ahead and call for the next witness. Tidy up the
Yes, Your
witness
Honor.
stand a bit.
I apologize.
I do. Thank you.
Ms. Chiquita, your witness?
It's Mr. Wallers.
Mr. Waller?
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Scott, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Will you please state your name for the record?
Yes, Dr. Lauren Scott.
Dr. Scott, how are you employed?
I'm an Associate Chief Medical Examiner at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Raleigh.
And what are your duties and responsibilities as an associate medical examiner?
Our primary duty is to determine the cause and manner of death in cases of sudden unexpected death and cases where death is presumed to be due to non-natural causes. So cases where death is presumed to be due to homicidal, suicidal, or accidental means. And we do this through various examinations, primary of which is the autopsy examination.
What is an autopsy examination? What does it entail?
Autopsy begins with an external examination of the body, noting physical characteristics such as length and weight, any identifying marks like scars or tattoos, then proceeds to documenting any external evidence of injury. We document things both through writing and through photographs at the time of the autopsy. After our external exam is done and we have documented all the injuries visible on the external body surface, we then proceed to an internal examination, making incisions into the chest cavity, into the abdominal cavity, and into the head to expose the organs, make note of any injuries in the internal organs, any evidence of natural disease. We then remove the organs from the body cavities for further examination. In certain cases, we'll take microscopic slides of the organs to look at, to document any further disease processes. And in some cases, we'll take samples of blood and other tissue for toxicology testing to look for drugs and alcohol. When all of our ancillary studies have returned, we then compile an autopsy report documenting all of our findings and our opinion as to the cause of death.
Do you only do autopsies there at the medical examiner's office, or do you also just do external exams?
We do autopsies and external exams at the medical examiner's office.
What's the difference between the external exam and the autopsy? In other words, why do you go forward with the autopsy on some occasions?
There are various reasons why we do an autopsy versus just an external exam. Pertinent to this case, in all cases that are suspected to be homicides, we do a full autopsy examination.
Dr. Scott, I want to back up and talk to you a little bit about your training and experience. Can you describe your educational background for us?
Yes, I attended medical school at the University of Buffalo, graduating from that in 2008. I then did 4 years of anatomic and clinical pathology residency training at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, finishing that in 2012. My final year of training was a fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Raleigh. I completed that in June of 2013.
What do you mean by forensic pathology?
Pathology in general is the study of disease. Forensic pathology focuses on diseases of a traumatic or non-natural manner. As I mentioned before, as forensic pathologists, our primary task is to determine the cause and manner of death.
And during your training and experience, Dr. Scott, approximately how many autopsies have you performed?
Somewhere between 950 and 975 at this point.
Going back to May of 2013, is that the period of time in which you were a fellow at the medical examiner's office?
Yes, that was towards the end of my fellowship year.
And can you describe for us kind of what the general duties and responsibilities are of a fellow with the medical examiner's office?
A forensic pathology fellow has the same duties as a full associate medical examiner. However, we are supervised by an attending physician who is a full associate chief medical examiner. They will review all of our findings and make sure they agree with them.
And to be clear, Dr. Scott, in May of 2013, even though you were doing a fellowship, were you a licensed physician here in North Carolina?
Yes.
Had the ability and knowledge and so forth to practice medicine and do these types of autopsies that you've described?
That's correct.
Who was, just for the record, your supervisor back in May of 2013?
For this particular case, it was Dr. Sam Simmons.
And do you go through a review process with any autopsy with other medical examiners there at the office?
For all of the autopsies we do as a fellow, they are reviewed by the full associate medical examiner.
And Dr. Scott, have you had the opportunity to testify in court prior to today's hearing?
I have.
Can you describe that for us, ma'am?
I've testified as to my findings of cause and manner of death in about 20 cases.
And have you been tendered as an expert before, Dr. Scott?
I have.
What area have you been tendered as an expert?
Forensic pathology.
How many times?
As many times as I've testified, so around 20.
And Dr. Scott, did you prepare an autopsy report in this case involving the victim, Miss Melissa Huggins-Jones?
I did.
Have you reviewed your findings and conclusions in that report and are prepared to testify here today?
I am.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask to tender Dr. Scott in the area of forensic pathology as an expert witness.
Any objection?
No objection.
Her testimony will be received as proffered.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Scott, moving to the date of May 14th of 2013, were you working at the medical examiner's office at that time, ma'am?
Yes.
And how did you become involved with the case of Miss Melissa Huggins-Jones?
Cases are reported to our office either by law enforcement or by investigatory agencies as potential homicides or sudden unexpected deaths.
And how does a victim of a homicide, how does the body actually get to the medical examiner's office?
We have authorized transporters who deliver decedents to our office.
We heard testimony about a WC7. Is that the...
That's typically the transporter for Wake County, yes.
And how is a body identified when it arrives there at your office, Dr. Scott?
There is usually some form of identification either on the body bag or on the body itself. In this case, believe there was an identification tag on the body. There was an identification tag encircling the left wrist and an identification tag on the body bag.
And who was the victim in this case?
Melissa Huggins-Jones.
And I believe, ma'am, you testified early a moment ago as to one of the first things that y'all do is kind of get a general physical description of the decedent.
Yes,
And was that done in this case?
it was.
Can you give us the general physical description of Miss Huggins-Jones?
Her length was 71.5 inches, which is equivalent to 5 foot 11.5. Weight was 181 pounds. She had blonde hair, straight and long, eyes were brown.
Do you the age?
Her age was 30 years old.
And how did you proceed in your investigation at that point?
I continued with the external examination of the body, documenting all of her injuries.
And can you walk us through that, please, Dr. Scott?
Yes. She had several injuries on her body. Most of the injuries that she had exhibit a combination of blunt and sharp force trauma. Sharp force trauma being injuries that are caused by an instrument with a cutting edge or a sharp edge. Blunt force trauma being injuries that are caused by an object without a sharp or cutting edge. So I'll kind of talk about what characteristics all of her injuries exhibited as I go through them.
Interrupt you just for a second there, Dr. Scott. Blunt force trauma, does it have to be caused by an object?
It doesn't have to be caused by an instrument. It could be caused by a part of the body, such as a fist. It could be caused by someone falling against the floor and striking their head on the floor, which is a blunt object. Anything that doesn't have a sharp or cutting edge to it.
Thank you.
So moving on to the injuries that I observed, she had a laceration on her right scalp, and this laceration extended through her scalp and impacted the skull, causing an indentation or partial fracture of the skull. This lesion had characteristics of both a blunt and sharp force injury, likely caused by an instrument that has a sharp cutting edge but is also capable of causing some tearing or blunt force to the skin surface. She had a large laceration extending from her left nose onto her right cheek. A laceration is a blunt force injury, so it's caused when an object without a sharp cutting edge strikes the skin surface with enough force that the skin surface actually splits open. This laceration extended into the internal area of her mouth, causing fracturing of the upper jawbone or the maxilla. It caused 2 of her teeth to be completely dislodged and 2 of her teeth to be partially dislodged. There was a small laceration on her chin, again laceration being a blunt force injury caused by an object without a sharp cutting surface striking the skin. There was a sharp force injury on her right neck. This was a superficial injury, did not extend far into the neck. Moving to the left side of her face, there was a small laceration on her left eyelid, again a blunt force injury, a laceration on her left temple, a bruise or contusion on her left forehead. A contusion or bruise is another type of blunt force injury, again caused by something that does not have a sharp or cutting edge. There was a bruise on the left side of her nose, an abrasion on her mid-forehead. An abrasion is another type of blunt force injury caused by an object impacting the skin surface and wearing away the outer layer of the skin to leave a lesion. She also had 3 injuries on her left cheek to just below her left ear. There was 1 injury on her left cheek, which had elements of both sharp and blunt force injury. These 3 lesions on her cheek and below the left ear, in my opinion, were primarily caused by an instrument that had a sharp cutting edge, but also was capable of inflicting a certain amount of blunt force. The lesion that was on her left cheek was superficial, just extended to the soft tissue underneath the skin. However, it had some abrasions at its outer edge, indicating that something blunt had also struck the skin surface there. There was another injury on her left cheek, again, primarily sharp force, but with some elements of blunt force. That lesion extended for about an inch down into her cheek in a downward, slightly frontward direction, and it impacted the upper jawbone, causing fracturing of the upper jawbone. The third injury on this left side of her face cheek region was below the left ear. Again, this showed a combination of sharp and blunt force injuries. The primary wound was sharp force, however, it again had some abrasions at its outer edge, indicating that there was something blunt that had also struck the skin surface at this location. And this lesion extended for about an inch and a half in a backwards direction behind the ear. It caused laceration of the external carotid artery, which is the major vessel that supplies structures of the left side of the face and also supplies blood to some of the neck structures and the tongue. After lacerating this external carotid artery, the track of this wound extended to the base of the skull, causing a partial fracture or gouge mark on the base of the skull, part of the skull you can feel on yourself just behind your left ear. And there was an additional small sharp force lesion extending below this main lesion underneath the ear. It extended down the left neck. This was what we call a superficial incised wound, so indicative of some sharp force object gently grazing across the skin surface to cause a small cut. That was the extent of her injuries on her face. Moving on to the injuries on her body, she had a chop wound on her left shoulder, the top part of her left shoulder. A chop wound is a wound that has a combined sharp and blunt force. This wound extended for about an inch down to the left collarbone. It impacted the left collarbone, causing a partial fracture and indentation on that left collarbone. Next to this, on the front upper left chest, there was a small puncture wound. This did not extend very far into the body surface. There was another puncture wound on the right upper chest, and this wound did extend for about a half an inch into the body. What caused this wound, in my opinion, was different from what caused some of her other injuries. The wound track for this one was very thin and narrow and extended far into the body surface, so it was some sharp force object that was thin. Moving on to another injury, she had a laceration, combined laceration and sharp force injury on her right upper chest. This extended just to the superficial tissue underneath, right underneath the skin. There was another injury on the back of her left shoulder. This was primarily a sharp force injury, again with some elements of blunt force to it. And this injury extended into the musculature of the upper left shoulder, traveling in an upward, slightly left to right direction for about 1 inch. There was another sharp force injury on the back of her right shoulder. This was a superficial injury which did not extend far into the body. She also had several injuries to her extremities. There was one bruise on the front of the left arm just underneath the elbow. There was a bruise on the front of her right wrist. There were several bruises on the back of the left forearm. several bruises on the back of the right elbow, several bruises on the front of the left leg extending from the thigh down to below the knee, a few bruises on the right knee, a single bruise on the front of the right leg, and a single bruise on the back of the left knee. There was also a small laceration near her right index fingernail. Laceration, again, being primarily a blunt force injury. This had some characteristics that could have indicated it was sharp force as well.
Dr. Scott, how many blows to the body did Miss Melissa Huggins-Jones suffer?
Not counting the bruises on her extremities, it was at least 18 different blows.
And where were these injuries concentrated?
Most of them were concentrated in the face, a few in the neck, and in the upper chest.
How many blows were there to the face and to the facial area?
To the face and neck region, there were a total of 12.
And then to the body, that would be 6 blows to the body.
6, not counting the bruises on the extremities.
Mr. Waller, it's 5 o'clock. We'll stop for the day and resume tomorrow morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to resume at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Please recall all the rules and instructions. Don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about the case. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters. No conversations with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. There is some chance during the day tomorrow that there'll be some adverse weather. We're keeping an eye on that. And then I've already mentioned that there's also some chance forecasted for Monday. What Ms. Harrell will do, I don't think that will impact our start time tomorrow. But in any event, if there's any change to our schedule, Ms. Harrell will call you at the numbers you have provided her. She's willing to do that. So if we need to make some scheduling change before court starts, she'll get on the phone and reach all of you. If you don't hear anything, just be here at 9:30 and we'll keep an eye on the weather throughout the day. I've already told you that we will go no longer than 1 o'clock tomorrow. It may be actually earlier than that. It's hard to tell at this point, but in any event, you will not stay past 1 o'clock tomorrow. And I'll also tell you that as far as next Friday, to the extent that we are here, we have also will be recessing at 1 o'clock as we've done on Fridays, this one and the last one. So you can plan on that accordingly as well, should we be here. All right, in any event, that'll be it. Thank you very much for your service. Please leave your notepads in your chairs. We'll see you at 9:30 tomorrow morning. All right. Outside the presence of the jury, are there any matters that you know of that we need to take up tomorrow? Before we recess? All right. I think it's safe to say that we will not get to closings tomorrow. I do have draft jury instructions that I would like to distribute. Of course, there are still some variables that exist, but I think it'd be helpful if you could take the time to read them between now and tomorrow, so that when we do get to the point of a charge conference, you'll at least have before you the thoughts that I have thus far in the case. If you will, right. So that, I believe that's all we have. If none of y'all have anything, so we'll just simply be in recess until 9:30 tomorrow.
We can safely assume that none of our out-of-state
Witnesses have to be here before Tuesday.
I think that is certainly correct. I think where we are now is we will complete the state's evidence. If it sounds like relatively early tomorrow, we will then hear any motions to be made at the close of state's evidence. We will make a determination whether there will be evidence and whether it be testimony from the defendant. And then in the scenario that there is no evidence, then we will move to a charge conference. If there is evidence, then we'll just go till 1 o'clock with evidence and carry on.
Thank you.
All right, very good.
Superior Court stands in recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning.